Lord be with you. This is a reading from the secret Gospel of Mark. And I invite you to listen really carefully. It's a reading you probably haven't heard before. It's from a secret Gospel of Mark. It's a strange kind of a reading, and it's the reading that I'm going to focus on for the homily. And most of it is from one passage, and then the last phrase is from a different part of the Gospel. And they come to Bethany, and this woman was there whose brother had died. She knelt down in front of Jesus and says to him, "Son of David, have mercy on me." But the disciples rebuked her. And Jesus got angry with them and went with her into the garden where the tomb was. Just then, a loud voice was heard from inside the tomb. Jesus went up and rolled the stone away from the entrance to the tomb. He went straight in where the young man was, stuck out his hand, dragged him by the hand, and raised him up. The young man looked at Jesus, loved him, and began to beg him that he might stay with him. Then they left the tomb and went to the young man's house. Incidentally, the young man was very rich. 6 days later, Jesus gave him an order. And when evening had come, the young man went to Jesus dressed only in a linen cloth. He spent that night with him because Jesus taught him the mysteries of the kingdom of God. From there, Jesus got up and returned to the other side of the Jordan. The sister of the young man whom Jesus loved was there, along with her mother and Salome. But Jesus refused to see them. A gospel inspired by God. Namaste, my brothers and sisters. Some of the most extraordinary detective stories that I've ever read, I've read in biblical journals, talking about how ancient papyri or fragments were found and how they were pieced together. It's an extraordinary piece of detective work very often. Some of the most vitriolic diatribes I've ever read in my life have been in the same journals, where scholars savage each other about their interpretations of various texts. And I want to talk about one of them today. It was a text, a fragment that was found in 1958 by a scholar called Morton Smith, and which he published in 1973, which unleashed a tirade of abuse against him. All kinds of claims that he forged this document, it didn't exist, all kinds of stuff. And the rampage went all the ways from people, evangelicals, who claimed that this man was the spawn of the devil for propagating these ideas, all the ways down to a very well-known, very well-established Catholic biblical scholar who ended his criticism by saying, moreover, Morton Smith is bald. Talk about childish kind of debate. So I want to talk about this today, because the reading that I just read comes from this document. And I'm going to make 4 main points today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the discovery and the publication and the reaction to this document. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the letter of Clement of Alexandria. Then I'm going to talk about the 3 Gospels of Mark. And then fourthly, I will say, Jesus the Avatar Revisited. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So the first piece then is the discovery and the publication and the reactions to this document. There was, at the time, Morton Smith in 1958 was a graduate student in theology at Columbia University, and he was sent to Israel. He was sent to a monastery called Mar Saba, which is about 12 miles southeast of Jerusalem, and his job was to catalogue all of the ancient manuscripts in their library there. And he's spending months and months and months at this really laborious task. And then one day, he's reading this old manuscript. It had actually been published as a book in 1646. And it's an account of letters from an early Christian martyr, a guy called Justin. But when he comes to the end of the book, there are 3 pages at the end of the book in which some copyist has inscribed in longhand. The rest of the book is printed, but he's inscribed a letter from Clement of Alexandria. Now, Clement lived from 150 AD to 215 AD. But it's written in hand in cursive style on the last 3 pages of the book. And it claims to be a letter from Clement of Alexandria. And this had never been seen before. And moreover, in this little piece, it talks about a secret gospel of Mark. So he's absolutely astounded. So he comes back to Columbia, he's working with his own professor, and over the period of 15 years, he manages to translate this and to interpret it. And then it's published in two ways. Harvard Press publishes a scholarly version of his work, and Popular Press publishes a book of his for the lay audience in 1973. And the backlash is immediately. And the backlash breaks down into two kinds of groups of scholars. Both the Catholic scholars and the evangelical Christians are outraged because there seems to be an implication, and if you were listening really carefully here, there seems to be an implication that Jesus may have been involved in some kind of homosexual activity. So this totally outraged them, so they dismissed this whole thing. The Protestant scholars were outraged for a very different reason. They were outraged because part of Smith's thesis was that Jesus was actually a real miracle worker, and scholars couldn't accept this. All the miracles of Jesus are just fantasy or mythology as far as they're concerned. So he claimed that on the basis of this, that Jesus actually was working miracles and creating altered states of consciousness in his audience. So the backlash was huge and immediate. One of the things Smith said, luckily by 1973 when this stuff was published, he already had tenure, so they couldn't oust him. Otherwise, he'd been dead in the water. So this brings me to the second point then. What was this document? And who was Clement of Alexandria? Clement of Alexandria obviously lived in Egypt. Alexandria at this time was the cultural center of the ancient world. It had the greatest library probably planet Earth has ever seen, until the Christians destroyed it about 367. But this is the year maybe 200 AD. And he is the bishop of Alexandria. Clement is the bishop of Alexandria. And there's a big dispute going on between two clerics. One guy called Theodore and the other guy called Carpocrates. And in the debate, which is a very public debate, Carpocrates at some stage appeals to the secret gospel of Mark. And this shocks Theodore. Theodore has never heard of this, so he's really upset. So he seems to be defeated by the presence of this document of which he's never heard and the arguments which are based on it. So he writes to the bishop, Clement of Alexandria, and he says, is there such a document? And secondly, what do you say to these arguments that Carpocrates is claiming on the basis of Mark? And Clement writes his letter, and this is the letter that was found in the back of this book. And it says, yes, there is such a document. But let me tell you about the origin of this document. Mark was a friend of Peter, and they lived in Rome. And on the basis of Peter's recollections and Mark's own recollections of Jesus, Mark wrote his gospel. But it was a gospel intended for an exoteric audience. It was a gospel intended to introduce people to Jesus Christ, but it didn't contain any of the inner teachings of Jesus Christ. So Clement says, when Peter was martyred in 65 AD, Mark fled to Alexandria, and he brought with him the original book, and he brought notes he'd taken from Peter, and he brought his own notes. And he wrote a second gospel, which is called the secret gospel of Mark. And this was the gospel of Mark, which was intended for a different audience. It was intended not just in an introduction to Christianity, but for people who really understood Jesus at a different level. They were getting Jesus at a different level. This was a different kind of teaching in very symbolic kinds of language. But Clement goes on, he says, but even in that gospel, Mark did not reveal everything. There are other rites and other rituals which are practiced for people who are ready to go from stage 2 to stage 3, which is unity consciousness. Now he says, unfortunately, we hold that secret gospel in our church here in Alexandria, but one of our presbyters was bribed by Carpocrates, and he made an illegal copy of this document, which he gave to Carpocrates. And Carpocrates took this document, and he totally mistranslated it because he wasn't at level 2. He totally misunderstood the language. Moreover, he added a whole bunch of stuff that is not in secret Mark. I guarantee you this. And so let me tell you. And then he goes on, and what we read today, he says, here are two passages that you asked me about. Because Theodore had asked him specific questions. He says, you asked me about this passage, and you asked me about this passage. So I'm going to tell you about these two passages. And I'm going to tell you where these fit. So if you go back to the Gospel of Mark, the ordinary Gospel, the first one, I'll tell you where the first piece fits in, and I'll tell you where the second piece fits in. Now this is the year about 200. The Bible as we know it, it wasn't broken up into chapters until about the 12th century. There were no chapters to any book of the Bible before the 12th century. And the chapters were not broken up into verses until the 15th century. And so Clement couldn't say, I want you to show you that this passage actually is an insertion between Mark chapter 10 verse 34 and Mark chapter 10 verse 35. That's exactly where it fits actually. But he couldn't have said that, so he has to say what the passage is before and what the passage is behind. And he says, that passage goes in there. And then he goes on to what we would call Mark chapter 10 verse 46. And it's a very strange passage. It doesn't make any sense to scholars. It's in two parts, and he says, the second piece that I included, that goes right into the middle there. And he says, he's obviously referring to a phrase that has been asked. He says, this phrase, naked man with naked man, it does not exist in Mark's secret gospel. Carpocrates made this up completely and inserted it. It is not there. And moreover, a lot of the other pieces that he's claiming, they are not in secret Mark. And then he goes and he says, and now I'll tell you how to interpret these passages. And then the document ends, unfortunately. So it's like we've been teased right to the end. Now it's come to the end of the last page, so presumably whatever copyist was doing it, he found some other papyri and he wrote there, or he inserted something to the back of the book, but it got lost. It's never been found since. So this is the origin of the letter and these two passages we've read today. Which brings me to my third point. The three Gospels of Mark. So it's obvious then that there isn't just a Gospel of Mark. That the initial, the one we call the Gospel of Mark, and it's the basis for Matthew's Gospel and for Luke's Gospel. Scholars have known for a long time that when you go to Matthew's Gospel and to Luke's Gospel, there are huge chunks of material which are lifted just straight out of Mark's Gospel. Mark's was the first written, and they just quote him. Now, even in this Gospel, this was the first one written, and it was written in Rome by Mark with the help of Peter for an audience who are just experiencing and encountering Christianity for the first time. They're not going to tell them the secret teachings. They're going to just introduce them to the person of Jesus. Now, of course, even that gospel, if you know how to read it with the proper mentality, you can see secret teachings in it. But for the average person meeting Christianity for the first time, they're just going to see it as some kind of a history of a man, his social teaching, and his miracles. So that's the first level of it. And then Peter is killed, he's crucified upside down in the year 65, and Mark flies to Alexandria, and he takes all his notes with him, and he takes the first version of his book with him. And in Alexandria, he begins to write a second version, which will now be known as the secret Gospel of Mark. But it's for a select audience. This one is not for general dissemination, because it's looking at people who've understood the first version and are ready for a more in-depth understanding. And he includes a whole bunch of extra stuff in this. But we're told, even in that second one, he did not include everything, because there are 3 stages to this process, not just 2. And so he teases us about talking about particular rituals that introduce people to a third level of this document. And so that's the progress of Mark. Now, we only have the first one, and there was no notion that there indeed was a second one until 1958, when Morton Smith found this document in the back of a book printed in 1646. Which brings me now to my most important and fourth point. Jesus the Avatar Revisited. Now, part of Morton Smith's thesis was this. He believed that Jesus was indeed a miracle worker. Now, this put him at odds with the scientific and the scholarly community. They regarded Jesus as a kind of a social worker, and that all these miracles attributed to him were just mythology. This man is claiming, no. He was an avatar who knew how to not only find portals and shift states of consciousness and jump dimensions himself, he had the ability, what the Hindus would call through Shaktipat, the ability to create that effect in some of his listeners through secret ceremonies. And so Smith is claiming that Jesus had particular rituals with which he was able to help the disciples shift their states of consciousness and experience the kingdom of God, not just as a belief, something they were going to experience after death, or not just as some kind of a dogmatic expectation, but they could actually experience the kingdom and move into unity consciousness. And there were particular rituals, he's claiming, that Jesus would have used. Baptismal liturgies. Chief among them would be the clothing with a linen garment, which you took off and went naked into the water, and then came back out and dressed in this new linen garment. It was a symbol of transformation. But part of the ritual was the recitation of particular kinds of mantras and hymns that created literally a hypnotic state or an altered state of consciousness. Now, in fact, this wasn't unique to Jesus. Jewish mystical tradition did precisely that. Greek magical tradition did precisely that. You find the same thing written in the books at Qumran, and subsequently the Byzantine Rite in Christian liturgy did the very same thing, creating liturgies where the repetition of particular kinds of images created an altered state of consciousness which allowed people to experience a different state and the kingdom of heaven, and not just hope for an expectation afterwards. So this incensed the scholarly world, this claim. Now to back up, let me explain what I mean here. A few Sundays ago, I talked to you about our languaging around God, and the reality that there are three kinds of language with which we attempt to wrestle with the notion of the transcendent. And the first kind of language is called cataphatic language. And cataphatic is the language that claims you can describe God ontologically. So this is language that says God is X, God is Y. You name particular characteristics. And I was at pains a few Sundays ago to say to you, the problems with this is they try to limit God using human language which can't contain him. So the notion that God is a person is cataphatic language. God is not a person. The idea that God is a creator, this is cataphatic language. God is not a creator. Manifestation emanates from God. God does not create ex nihilo. We've created a God who's partisan. God is not partisan. We've created a God who's a micromanager of human affairs, and God does not micromanage human affairs. We've created a God who's a lawmaker, a law enforcer, and a law punisher, and God is not a lawyer. So cataphatic language gets us into all kinds of troubles really quickly. So there was a second kind of languaging that evolved, and this is called apophatic language. And this is speaking of God, of what God is not. So you make a statement, you say X, God is not X. Y, God is not Y. Z, God is not Z. So you're trying to help people break out of categories. It's exactly what Zen Buddhism does with the koans, is trying to go beyond mind. But there's a third kind of language. If you're forced to speak about God, and you know that you can't use cataphatic language because it's ridiculous, and you know that you have to say something to the audience, then you begin to use parabolic language, the third kind, or metaphor or allegory. And Jesus was a past master at doing this. Jesus, insofar as he speaks about the transcendent, is always using parable and allegory and metaphor. And he's doing this because he's an avatar. I said to you again a few Sundays ago, I do not believe that Jesus was a Jew. He did not come to promote Judaism, and he did not come even to reform Judaism. And he certainly wasn't a Christian. He did not come to form a new religion, and he did not come to be an anti-Semite. Jesus was an avatar. And one of the first things an avatar does immediately is to disidentify with race and gender and socioeconomic status and realize that they're from God, they're bite-sized pieces of God. So they disidentify very quickly with all the trappings of incarnation. And Jesus came as an avatar, and the function of an avatar is to point out the portals to us, to help us to jump dimensions and to allow us to shape shift in our states of consciousness. And I said to you, little children do this instinctively, but the rest of us, we've forgotten how to do it. And this is why Jesus is choosing his language really, really carefully. As Jesus speaks in parables, the members of the audience are totally able to unpack his message according to the level they've reached, their own developmental level spirituality. And so there'll be at least three levels. There'll be people listening to Jesus, and all they will hear from him is that he's a teacher of moral behavior and social justice. That's fine, but that's only level one. There are people who are hearing Jesus, and he's inviting them to the next stage, which is devotional adherence. It's the celebration, it's a liturgy that changes our experience. And the third level is shifting a state of consciousness into a total unity consciousness. And Jesus is moving towards this the whole time. And the three Gospels of Mark represent those three pieces. The first one is an exoteric teaching for people who are being introduced to Christianity, and it seems like a social commentary and about ethical behavior. The second, secret Gospel of Mark, but it's couched in symbolic language, is very different. And the third is the initiation into unity consciousness. Now you got a guy like Carpocrates, who's barely at level 1, and he now has a document in his hands that's teaching level 2, and he totally misinterprets it, and he propagates his own false teachings. And unfortunately, we don't have Clement's understanding of what this document really meant. So I'm going to offer my own in the absence of his. And it's that this death of this young man, it fits into Mark's gospel in the following way. If you read the ordinary Gospel of Mark, there's a story about a rich young man who came to Jesus, and he said, "Good master, what must I do to be saved?" Jesus said, "You've read the scriptures. Don't steal, don't kill, don't tell lies. Honor your father and your mother. And the young man says, yeah, I know all that. I've kept all those since I was a little boy. What else do I need? And we're told, Jesus looked at him and he loved him. And he said, okay, you want to go to the next step? Sell everything you have and come follow me. Be one of my disciples. And we're told the young man got really, really sad because he was very rich. He turned away sadly and he left. And that's the end of the story according to ordinary Mark. Now we get this piece. This was the missing piece. Some time passes by and the young man dies. But it's not that he's buried in a tomb, it's that he's now died to his old way of thinking and his own paradigm. And now he encounters Jesus again, and there's a totally different relationship between them. Now Jesus realizes this kid has gone from stage 1 to stage 2, and he's ready for stage 3. And now Jesus initiates him. And this ceremony then of the young man coming to Jesus naked except for the linen robe, and spending the night with Jesus so that Jesus introduced him to the mysteries of the kingdom. It was a baptismal introduction into unity consciousness, using specifically this kind of language, which Carpocrates will take and totally misinterpret, because Carpocrates is nowhere near stage 2. And then this final piece at the end of it, it comes from a different part of Mark's gospel. There's a statement in Mark chapter 10, verse 46 that doesn't make any sense, and it's never made sense to scholars, and they've always wondered why it is. Chapter 10, verse 46 says, and Jesus came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho, and they say, give me a break. So why do they say he came to Jericho and he's leaving? There must be something missing in between his coming to Jericho and his leaving Jericho. Now this is actually the last week of Jesus' life. The second phrase at the very, very end comes right there in the middle. And so what it looks like is this. And Jesus came to Jericho. And the sister of this young man and his mother and Salome, they wanted to see Jesus and he refused to see them. And as he was leaving Jericho, and then there's another story. So what's this about? Why did his sister and his mother and this woman called Salome, why did they want to talk to Jesus and why did they refuse to speak to them? Again, we don't know from Clement of Alexandria, so I'm going to stick in my own interpretation. My belief somehow is that this is the last week of Jesus' life. He has more important things to do than to talk to people who are worried about their son and their brother. Because what they're really concerned about is this young man was the leader of the family. Very possibly the father was dead. This young man owned all this property, and they're women with no male head of the household. And this kid has gone off after Jesus. He's abandoned the farm, he's abandoned all his possessions, and he's abandoned his sister and his mother. And they want to say to Jesus, look, can you talk some sense into him? You know, he's the only man in the house. He's leaving all this stuff behind. Can you kind of talk sense to him? So Jesus doesn't want to hear about it. He's too busy for one thing. He has 6 more days to live himself. And he realizes that this young kid has seen the light, and he's not going to debate this with people who haven't themselves come to that place. So it has a totally different significance when we reach these places. And that's the value and the importance still of our reading the scriptural traditions of all the great spiritualities. And so the important question, the take-home question I want to leave us with today is this. When you listen to this gospel today, at what level are you hearing it?